the moment has finally come for me to test drive the brand new BMW M5, and I have to say from the get-go, I have been very curious about this car ever since it was unveiled, and the reasons might be plain obvious. There's been so much controversy going on around this car that I had to drive it myself to see exactly who is right and who is not. I don't usually form my opinion about brand new cars by what other people say. I know you guys have to do that if you're following us, content creators, but personally I found that a number of times I don't really agree even with the most praised reviewers out there, Chris Harris and so on. So really I just wanted to drive it. Ever since it was unveiled at Goodwood last year, I was very curious about it. This car has been around this neighborhood since November, and I really had to wait until March to get my hands on it because of the weather, because of some issues I had. Well, it's a good thing that I finally got to drive it. So what is it? Well, you probably already know this is the high performance version of the BMW 5 Series, and you can actually tell just by looking at it. As a matter of fact, you'd have to be near blind not to be able to make the difference between this car and a regular 5 Series. Whenever you see one of these on the road, you know there's something special going on. And this is a different approach compared to what BMW M used to do in the past. If you look at cars like the E39, the E34, even the F10, the F90 did take things to a new level, but if you look at those cars, their styling wasn't greatly or as different compared to an M Sport model as it is the case today. This car compared to an M Sport 5 Series is completely different. I'm talking about the fenders, the front end, the wing mirrors and everything, the rear bumper, everything is very, very different. It's a lot wider, the track is wider and so on. So you'll instantly recognize it as an M car. Is that a good thing? I don't know. I like the more subtle approach. I don't like to stand out, but we do live in a very interesting world where social media does dictate a lot of stuff and people want to showcase their potential and their success in a number of ways, not necessarily by what they say, but what they show, right? We live in this Instagrammable world where people want to show what they have more than anything. So yeah, this definitely says that you're a successful person. It's an expensive, powerful car. Not anyone can afford it. Up front, you'll notice that we have a very aggressive grille, very aggressive bumper to let a lot of air feed into the engine bay. So plenty of cues to tell you that this is no regular M car or no regular car. In terms of the side profile, we have huge wheels, 21-inch wheels on the back, 20-inch wheels in the front. They'll actually look pretty good. And if you want to spec your car with carbon ceramic brakes, which are an optional feature worth about 10,000 euros, you will have golden brake calipers like we do over here. In terms of brake size, you gain 10 millimeters in diameter. So the standard metal brakes are 410 millimeters, while these ones are 420, and they do save about 25 kilos of weight overall. So if that matters on a car that tips the scales at about 2.5 tons, well, that's up to you, but it is unsprung weight, so that might be felt in the steering. At the back, the brake discs are exactly the same dimension, no matter if you go for the metal or the carbon ceramic brakes, 398 millimeters. This car also has the carbon package on the outside. We have carbon side mirrors, a carbon roof that basically saves about 30 kilos compared to the regular car, and a carbon boot spoiler. So a couple of cues. This option is about 3,000 euros, not very expensive, but they do tell you a story. And around the back, of course, we have a very aggressive bumper with 4 tailpipes because this is a high performance car. So what's hiding under the hood? Well, you probably already know that the M5 has gone hybrid. So we're not talking about the same 4.4 liter V8 the previous generation had, the S63. This is the S68. It's an improved version of that engine that can be found on a number of cars these days, not only on the M5. You can find it on the XM, you can find it on the BMW X7 M60 and the X5 M60, on the X5M, and so on, in different versions of tuning. In this case, we are talking about a plug-in hybrid version. So the internal combustion engine by itself is a twin turbo V8, right, with a hot V setup. Basically, the turbines are mounted inside the V of the engine block in order to make the throttle response better. This one makes 585 horsepower and 750 Newton meters of torque. But it gets some help from a 200 horsepower, 197 horsepower electric motor mounted inside the gearbox that can also deliver 280 Newton meters of torque, but through a reduction gear can also offer up to 450 Newton meters of torque in the first gear. And you can actually feel the car switching from the first gear to the second gear whenever you're driving in electric mode. And it feels very lively off the line. We're going to talk about that when we're driving it. Together they can deliver 727 horsepower and 1000 Newton meters of torque. Since this is a plug-in hybrid, we also have a battery in the floor. It's an 18.6 kilowatt hour battery. That's the usable capacity. The total capacity is about 21 kilowatt hours, and it's split into two sides in the floor, because right down the middle you have the transmission tunnel and the EVAC. So that should give you a range of about 70 kilometers according to BMW, and should allow the car to drive in electric mode up to 140 kilometers an hour. But I don't think that was the goal here. The goal was to cut on the emissions and make this car a bit more eco-friendly. What I can tell you is that it feels very powerful altogether. Now, of course, all of this technology comes with a cost, which is weight. And in that regard, BMW had to upgrade the stiffening of everything that's going on over here. So we have a lot of cross braces, a lot of shear metal shears under the floor and in the back as well, to make it as stiff as possible to hold on to its 2.5 ton weight. It's also all-wheel drive. We have MX drive on this car. That all-wheel drive system was also revised to work with the 8-speed ZF torque converter gearbox, which no longer has a torque converter. But this MX drive system has a new transfer case that was optimized, and of course the engine was optimized as well on lubrication and cooling. Cooling is a huge deal on this engine. The MX drive system can be configured. Of course, we're going to see when we get inside the car how you can do that. It can be configured to run in four-wheel drive sport, and two-wheel drive, which is rear-wheel drive, just like it was before. And we still have an active M differential on the rear axle, which is electronically controlled and can actually push up to 2000 Newton meters of torque to either side in the back. So that's quite impressive. Also, the engine has hydraulic engine mounts, which are made so that they can stiffen up everything under here to give you a more hardcore feeling, if you will. So there's been a lot of work done under here in order to make this car a great performer, and I think it delivers. We're going to talk about that when we get inside the car and actually drive it. Let's start the interior tour as usual with the boot. So since this car has a platform that was designed from the get-go to host batteries in the floor, you don't suffer from any space loss like it is on the E53 AMG, for example, that has a minuscule boot, only 370 liters. Over here we have 446 because the batteries are in the floor, so they don't take up any additional space in here. It's not a huge trunk, but it's okay for most people, and you will have to deal with these cables all the time because we are talking about a plug-in hybrid after all. Let's hop in the back. Well, I'm not gonna get into it because, as I said, the space is identical to the 5 Series. It's not a huge amount of space, but if you're under 6 feet tall, you should be fine even over here in the back. The main issue I found is that this door sill is quite high. If you have a big foot, it's gonna be tricky getting your feet in and out, but there's plenty of room once you get inside. What I don't like is the build quality of the materials. Like on the old model, you could get extended leather as an option, so you could have all this door card covered in leather. That's no longer an option. We do have a soft touch material over here, but it's definitely not up to the same standard as the previous generation, right? So we have some cheap plastic over here that really shouldn't be here, but I don't know. We have, of course, blinds, and I like this detail over here on the back of the driver's seat. Now, let's hop in front, but before we do, I want to show you something that the car does whenever you unlock it. So when you get to the car, you unlock it, open it, and you have an animation that welcomes you on board. Nice, right? I actually like it. So let's talk about the build quality. The same goes over here. Not leather, but a soft touch plastic. Doesn't really feel as expensive as it should on a $160,000 car. And yeah, it's okay. We have the Bowers & Wilkins sound system over here and some carbon fiber trims. They're about 3,000 euros extra. Buttons for a number of functions. I'm not gonna go into everything. That's not the point of this review, but I do like the seats. They are adjustable in a number of positions, including the side bolsters can be tightened to keep you in check even better. I like this Kyalami orange setup. It's absolutely brilliant in my book. And I like the illuminated M5 logos over here and the one on the door sill. So yeah, looks pretty nice. So we have the new M steering wheel over here. Another issue with coast cutting, we don't have soft closed doors anymore, and most of the time I have to close the door twice. Yeah, not cool. So let's talk about the steering wheel. We have the traditional by now M1 and M2 buttons, right? The paddle shifters in the back, looks pretty good, pretty simplified as we see on a number of cars these days, and of course the two screens over here. But unlike on other cars, this is running a M-specific infotainment screen, right? So we have these tiles, diagonal tiles over here that look different, and you have some additional features, right, that you can only get on M cars, like the drivetrain info and the setup over here, right? So you can adjust it in any way you want. And we also have the stupidest trend in the industry right now with the interior cameras, and we also have games on this. Nobody's gonna game on this when you can actually drive this car and it can be so fun as it is right now. Furthermore, what we need to talk about is the fact that right now we have lost a number of things inside, such as the gear shift lever, and I think that's a big minus for M cars. I absolutely love that big chunky gear shift lever we had on the F90, right? That also had a very interesting way of operating it that mimics a manual gearbox. The one you get on the M3 and M4 today is the same but with different shape, right? So you can only use these right now. You can no longer use the shifter to change gears. You can only use the pedals. I'm gonna miss that. Also, since this is an M car, we have the M logo over here on the iDrive rotary dial, right? Looks pretty good. And we have these 4 very important buttons. Because this is an M hybrid car, you have a dedicated menu for the hybrid system, which allows you to go through different setups. For example, e-control allows you to charge the battery while on the move, but it also heats up the engine to make everything smooth. You have the electric mode, which is by default activated when you start the car, as you can see. We have hybrid mode, which is basically like electric, but when you run out of battery, the car will turn on the internal combustion engine to help out. We have the dynamic mode, which activates the electric motor all the time and the internal combustion motor all the time to give you the maximum power. And you have Dynamic Plus, which is only to be used for short distances and on track. Maybe you want to set a certain lap time and so on. It will deactivate after a while, actually, to protect the electric motor. So you cannot run in Dynamic Plus all the time. Then you have M mode, the button for M mode, which basically changes the way the car interacts with you. In road version, you have every system activated and everything inside the car. But when you go into sport mode, check this out. Oh, I have to start the car first. Hear that? That's the electric sound the car now makes when you turn it on. So let's go into sport mode. Check this out, right? We get the M colors on the interior lighting system. And of course the instrument cluster changes when you go into sport mode. Into road mode it looks like this, and in sport mode it looks like this. And then there's track mode, which is supposed to be used only on the track. It looks like this. You can change the information shown on the left, but the tire pressure will be probably the most important. It turns off the system and every other distraction, every other driving aid and everything in between to make sure you are focused on what you're doing on track. I use sport mode most of the time. And then you have the setup button over here, which, as you probably already know, allows you to configure absolutely everything you could possibly wish on this car, from the drivetrain setup to the energy recovery, because this is a hybrid now, to the comfort of the suspension, the drive logic, and so on. So you can even adjust the brake system, right, to see how sensitive it can be. Then you can save your settings into 2 different configurations that are assigned to these buttons over here, so that you don't have to go into every single setup every single time, right? I think it's a bit much. I only kept the car in comfort in terms of steering, chassis, and so on. I only changed the drivetrain setting to Sport Plus every now and then. For example, this is my setting for M1, right? That's all I changed. Yeah. Sounds good, doesn't it? So, what else should I tell you about? Well, we have wireless chargers over here, cup holders, USB-C ports, everything you could find in a regular 5 Series, and a very nice head-up display that changes depending on the driving mode you're in. So, for example, if I switch to road mode, it looks like this. If I go into sport mode, it looks like this, right? So yeah, quite interesting. But let's drive the car and talk about it some more. Initially, when I started driving this car, I was kind of frustrated with it because it would simply not allow me to drive it with the internal combustion engine on. So from what I could gather, as long as you have some juice in the battery, just the tiniest amount, the car will run in electric mode around town as much as possible. I think that was set up by BMW specifically to cut down on emissions, but it does get frustrating at times because I couldn't get it to keep the internal combustion engine on. So the one way I found you could do that was switching the M hybrid setup to dynamic. If you go into dynamic, it will turn on the internal combustion engine, but it will not keep it on for forever until you turn it off, right? After a while, the car automatically switches back to electric mode. The same goes if you switch the setup for the throttle response and the engine to the sportiest setting. It will stay on for a while, but after a while, it will switch back to electric for some reason. I don't know exactly why. It was quite frustrating because if you're gonna buy an M5, you probably want to get access to the whole 727 horsepower this car can offer at all times. Don't get me wrong, around town, those 200 horsepower of the electric motor will be enough for most people. But if you want access to all of the power, you have to do all sorts of tricks in order to gain access to them, and sometimes it just goes back to electric mode, and I really didn't appreciate that. Now, around town, this car is absolutely brilliant, and I was talking about the duality of M cars in my previous reviews. The fact that you can actually have a comfortable cruiser like a 7 Series and use it around town without getting any back pain, drive your kids to school with it, and then just go rip up some asphalt on a highway. This car takes things to a whole new level because it is so refined around town, especially compared to the previous generation. The added weight isn't necessarily felt when you're driving around town unless you hit like some serious potholes. That's where you're gonna feel the added weight, especially on the rear axle, which occasionally does send a thunk in the cabin. But other than that, this is very refined, very comfortable, and especially if you're running it with the internal combustion engine off, it's incredibly quiet, so you will feel like you're driving an electric car. As for the range around town, well, BMW says about 70 kilometers of range at most. You can also drive this car in electric mode on the highway at 140 kilometers an hour. But the truth of the matter is I only got about 32 kilometers of range, of pure electric range. I think that's enough. It's more than I needed during my one day around town with it. I did all my chores without needing any more range from it. And charging it will take about 3 hours, but that's okay. So that's not the main goal of hybridizing this car. For example, as I was saying, right? So I turned dynamic mode earlier, and now we're back to electric, even though I want the car to give me all of its power, right? Let's switch into M1 mode. In this mode, I have internal combustion set to sport. Let's see how long it takes until the car switched back to electric mode. And I don't know why it's doing that, but it's quite frustrating. Right, so around town, very relaxed feeling. You will be a bit stressed by the size of the car. Parking it may be an issue because you have a really tall sitting hood. The visibility isn't that great up front, right? But you do have great cameras and sensors and everything, and they do come as standard, and they will help out a lot. But I was still kind of nervous navigating through tiny, narrow streets. As for the fuel consumption, I think that's where you will feel the biggest improvement. Around town, my average was 15 liters per 100 kilometers covered, of course, combined with 15 kilowatt hours of electric power. But that is quite amazing. I remember the last M5 I drove, the F90, had an average around town of about 20-25 liters at the least. I could rarely get under 25 liters per 100 kilometers covered. And you will need this car to be very efficient around town because the fuel tank isn't that big, about 50-60 liters in total. So yeah, you need to pay attention to those aspects. But overall, quite a refined experience around town. But that's not necessarily why you buy an M5, is it? You know we have to launch this car, right? Theoretically, what you saw back there took longer than 3.5 seconds because this is how much the M5 takes from 0 to 100. But we were way above 100 kilometers an hour back there. And the torque you feel when you launch is quite amazing. Also, to me, it feels like this car, compared to the F90 generation, spins its wheels when you launch it, its rear wheels, a lot more. I think that might have something to do with the torque it has to deal with. But what's very frustrating about this car is what I mentioned earlier. So right now, I'm in M2 mode, which is like the most powerful setup I could get in order to benefit from all the power this car has, right? So we launched it, drove it for another 500-600 meters, and now the car is back into electric mode for some reason. And it did that a lot during my time with it. It switches, once again, it switched back to electric mode. I don't really get why it does that. It's not allowing me to enjoy it. I'm in race mode. Maybe if I switch into track mode, it will let me drive it more with the internal combustion engine turned on, but it's quite a frustrating experience. I don't know if it's a protection of some sorts because it's cold out, but I don't think so. I mean, the tires are at about 30 degrees Celsius. I have everything up to running temperature. I don't know why this car is behaving like this, but I can tell you that I did have some stints with it, driving in a more enthusiastic fashion, and I can tell you a bit about the way it drives. So let's talk about the weight. Everybody's talking about the weight. Yes, you do feel the weight when you go into corners doing illegal speeds, right? So when you push the car to the absolute limit, you will feel its weight. I think compared to the F98, which I drove last night, to kind of refresh my memory, I think it understeers a bit more and earlier, just because it has that extra weight on board. I think it oversteers like crazy if you wanted to. The grip, considering the weight of the car, the mechanical grip is great. Woo! And you can definitely have fun with it. There are some other key differences between the two, to be honest. One of them is the fact that this one has more brutal shifts. Whenever you're in manual mode, it feels a lot more hardcore than the previous generation. And I think the torque feels more intoxicating than on the previous generation. Especially in a straight line, this car feels like a totally different monster. However, over potholes and in the corners, the F90 will carry more speed. That's just physics, there's nothing you can actually do about that. I actually like the brakes on this car. As I mentioned, we have the carbon ceramic brakes, and I'm not talking about the fact that they didn't fade, because I didn't go to the track to test out this car really hardcore. But I'm talking about the fact that the pedal feel is very predictable and very consistent, which is not the case with a lot of plug-in hybrids, right? So yeah, it does inspire confidence, and you know exactly what the car is doing with the brake pedal. The steering is direct, but when it comes to feedback, it doesn't even come close to the F90. The F90 does translate a lot more of what's going on with the front wheels than this car, right? And the steering in the F90 feels a lot heavier in Sport Plus mode than this one. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but because most of the time just having a heavier steering setup means nothing. Actually, it's just heavier to turn the wheel. It doesn't bring any additional feedback, but on the F90 you actually have more feedback coming in through the steering wheel. And I think this car is a bit more tail happy just because it has that extra torque at its disposal, but other than that they are very similar. So overall, this definitely feels like a Grand Tourer, and driving it on the highway I definitely could feel that compared to the F90. The F90 was noisier, and I think that could be an advantage if you're looking for a sportier car, right? So it does remain the sportier setup overall. It was noisier, it was a lot thirstier. For example, with this car, on a series of B-rolls driving very calmly, I could get 8 liters per 100 kilometers covered as fuel consumption, which is absolutely amazing. On the highway, that figure went up to just about 10 liters. So it does have some advantages compared to the F90. But it depends a lot on what you're looking for. That's the main thing to take away from this experience. While it is more brutal on the upshifts, and it is faster at higher speeds, and it is more efficient, it's definitely not as agile and as composed as the F90 when you're driving in a hardcore on the track fashion, right? However, that's mainly because of the weight. But the weight can also play for you, not only against you. What I mean by that is the fact that in damp weather, I drove both of these cars in damp weather, this car managed to put the power down a lot easier. That's because it has more weight on the wheels, and it was able to transfer that power to the ground easier. Compared to the F90, the F90 felt a bit more jumpy and a bit more, I don't know, rebel and more unstable than this one in damp weather. However, if you drive both of them on good weather, good tires, summer tires, you know, heat everything up, I think the F90 will be faster than this car in most situations. But it's also more uncomfortable. So at the end of the day, it will depend on what's more important to you. What I can wholeheartedly say is that this car is now a GT, just like the M8 Grand Coupe used to be, or the M8 Coupe, if you will. This is more of a GT car, whereas the F90 M5 is the sportier alternative. So that brings us to the conclusion of this video. So, all of that being said, what's the takeaway here? Well, you might be surprised, but I think this is a very good deal. And I'm going to tell you why. As I mentioned before, for this review, I test drove the previous generation M5 to see the cars back to back and how they perform. Now, that car had a price tag of 160,000 euros back in 2019. This car has a price tag, just as you see it spec'd right here, fully optioned, of 160,000 euros 6 years later. And that, in my book, is a very good deal, because if you don't take into account the inflation, the rising cost of materials, the fact that we have a huge battery in the floor, and all the added technology this car brings to the table, it's quite amazing how BMW manages to sell this car at the exact same price. And from that perspective, it is a good deal. It is a good deal if you compare it to other rivals. For example, a few months back, I tested the E53 AMG, and that was also 160,000 euros, also fully spec'd, but it had a 6-cylinder under hood and 100 and something horsepower less. So quite a tricky pick, right? We're going to have to wait for the E63 AMG to see the price tag that car will have to get a better idea how it compares to this one. Then there's also the RS6 Avant, which is the one I would get, but the RS6 right now is going out of production. It's an old car, and I am guessing that the new generation will also be a plug-in hybrid, so the discussion is nullified around the drivetrain. So yeah, this remains a best buy. Is it still an M5? Definitely. Some people will say this is no longer a sports car, but was the M5 a sports car? If you think about sports cars, do you usually go for a E-segment car like this one? Yes, sure, the M5 was impressive in terms of the performance it offered for its size. Absolutely, it was mind-bending what it could do, and it still is mind-bending what it can do. But it wasn't necessarily a sports car, it was a fast sedan. And this is exactly what this does. What was mostly appreciated, and what I mostly appreciate on M cars, is their dual character. Because back in the day, the M car, or the M5, was a car that would allow you to take your kids to school and also go on the track with it at the push of a button, or maybe just pressing harder on the gas pedal. This one has even more faces to it. So it can be an eco-friendly car, it can be fuel efficient, very comfortable, a GT car, and you can also track it if you want to, but if you track it, it's not going to be as fun as the F90, but it's not very far off. And I think that is just impressive. But at the end of the day, I am also curious about what you guys think about it. So let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are on the new M5. And until next time, of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep this channel alive.